Black lives were lost, black businesses were destroyed, and black communities were completely decimated. James Baldwin called it Negro removal, because what was happening is our communities were yet again under attack by the federal government. So our local and state governments can never meet the bill required to close the racial wealth gap, which some of our leading economists estimate is minimally $14 trillion.
It's not just about us receiving a check, but once we have the check, how do we as a people pull our economic resources together about if we want to continue to live in this house, or do we want to separate and build something for ourselves?
On average, black families have $1.1 million less wealth than white families. Estimated that the median wealth of black families in Chicago is $0 because they completely ignore the pathways taken towards white wealth accumulation and black wealth extraction. Child support debt for a lot of the men who I have the great privilege of working with through my organization, Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities. This is a form of debt that can get all the way up to the hundreds of thousands of dollars if not addressed appropriately.
People to come together and unite around a righteous and just cause. Reparations is one of the longest justice-based movements in this country.
First, it starts with affirming publicly that a true reparations program must be federally led, federally funded, and designed specifically for black American descendants of U.S. slaves.
Our wealth was stolen from us, and reparations is a way for us to reclaim it in more ways than one and build something that we can call our own and have it so that righteousness is at the foundation.
This is technically the origin story for the reparations movement in this country is William T. Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which is also affectionately known as the 40 Acres and a Mule.
Like John the Revelator in the book of Revelations, he talked a great deal about Babylon the Great has fallen because she has become a habitation of evil and wickedness for all who stay within her. And his instructions were to come up out of her.
Look! This is the eye of the trenches!
We're here at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for the Reparations Commission public hearing. So I had a great honor today of speaking about the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap specifically. And so I'm praying that God blesses this message and allows for it to resonate with the people who will benefit from it.
Absolutely. So where are you coming from with it today?
Coming from Chicago, Illinois, representing fathers, families, and healthy communities.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Before I jump into my talk, it's very important for me to give honor and praise to the God of justice and the God of righteousness. The God of justice and the God of righteousness is the one who brings forth the light of understanding that can only come from truth that is spoken courageously, truth that is spoken unabashedly, and truth that is spoken unashamedly. And it's my prayer today that the truth that I have to share with those of you all in the listening audience is received with not only an open ear, but also an open heart, an open mind, and more importantly, an open spirit. I also want to acknowledge the commissioners for the work that you all are doing. I've shared this with you all previously, but I also would be remiss not to reiterate that you all are not only doing the work of our ancestors, but you all are doing the work of our present day citizens who are definitely victims of injustice, but through your work, we're bringing about solutions that will make justice a reality for our people. So thank you. With that being said, I want to jump into my talk with you all. I only have a few moments, but I plan to use them in a way that will, again, hopefully bring forth the truth that is needed to meet the moment. Repairing the breach, closing the racial wealth gap through reparations. Is the clicker working? Probably not. Next slide, please. So, what is wealth? Wealth is essentially what you own, your assets, minus what you owe. And so when we think about assets, these come in various forms. You have assets that are financial in nature. This can look like cash, it can look like savings, it can look like checking or money market accounts. We're also talking about stocks, bonds, mutual funds, the like. We also have to account for those retirement accounts. Again, these are all concrete examples of financial assets. We also have to think about physical assets, which come in the form of home ownership through either one's primary residence and or rental properties that they may own that are also in their possession. We also have to think about vehicles, and also something that we don't discuss enough is jewelry, art, and other collectibles that accumulate value over time and become one of those assets that can be passed down to succeeding generations. We also have to think about business and investment assets as well. And so examples of these include, again, ownership in the business, thinking about rental income properties, and intellectual property, patents that individuals own that, again, allow them to accumulate wealth in their lifetime, and if they're lucky, or if their family or descendants are lucky, these are assets that are passed down to succeeding generations. Now, when we think about debt, a couple of examples of this includes mortgage debt, student loan debt, credit card debt, medical debt, child support debt. For a lot of the men who I have the great privilege of working with through my organization, Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities, this is a form of debt that can get all the way up to the hundreds of thousands of dollars if not addressed appropriately. Now, when we think about what some of the national statistics suggest, on average, black families have $1.1 million less wealth than white families. A recent report that was commissioned by the Chicago Community Trust, the Color of Wealth Chicago report, estimated that the median wealth of black families in Chicago is $0. And again, at a national level, if we were thinking about black men's wealth position, it is roughly $10,000, which is 8 times less than what we observe for white men. Now, oftentimes when we have conversations about the wealth gap that exists in our country, there are inaccurate, misleading stories that are promoted within the public that do more harm than good because they completely ignore the pathways taken towards white wealth accumulation and black wealth extraction. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that federal policies are primarily responsible for the wealth that was built for white Americans, white families, white communities, and the lack of wealth that we observe within black families, black households, and the black community. And so what I decided to do today was to spend some time deconstructing a lot of the myths that exist about the origins of wealth accumulation and the wealth gap in this country by going through various policy errors that speak unequivocally to the racial wealth gap. The first one that we have to pay attention to, because this is technically the origin story for the reparations movement in this country, is William T. Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which is also affectionately known as the 40 Acres and a Mule. These were essentially This was essentially a special order that was sent down by President Lincoln immediately following the Civil War. He sent a special envoy, which included the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and also General William T. Sherman, to meet with 20 black leaders in Savannah, Georgia. Coming out of that conversation, Reverend Garrison Frazier, who was the spokesperson for the group, requested that black Americans receive not only land, but to be left alone. That's another part of this conversation that we rarely talk about. His request was not just for the land, but it was also the ability for us to go create a nation for ourselves. Primarily because he knew that the prejudice that existed between white and black Americans in that day was so deep that it would take centuries to overcome. Now, moving forward, General Sherman actually granted 5.3 million acres to go to the formerly enslaved, and it stretched from South Carolina's Sea Islands all the way down to northern Florida. Now, what happened in actuality was that only 40,000 freemen received 4,000 acres of land. However, after President Lincoln's assassination and when President Johnson came into political power, he reversed all of the progress immediately overnight. And so all of the land that had went to the formerly enslaved was immediately confiscated by the federal government and then given back to the slave owners. What happened at the same time, however, was the introduction of the Homestead Act of 1862, and I believe the subsequent legislation came in 1865. Now, what happened with this policy is you had 160-acre land allotments going to approximately 1.5 million white Americans, many of whom were also European immigrants coming into the country to continue this settler colonial project within the Western territories of the United States. And it is estimated today that at least 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of the Homestead Act. That's just the wagon train period. Fast forward to the bloodlust period, and my brother who spoke before me talked about the racial terror campaigns that occurred by way of public lynchings in this country. What also happened during this period, which runs alongside those public lynchings, was the complete destruction, decimation of black communities that were thriving socially, economically, and politically. Oftentimes we think about the Tulsa massacre that occurred in the Greenwood community of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and we assume that that was the only white terror campaign that occurred in this country. We had upwards of 100 that took place throughout this nation, oftentimes with the support of the federal government. And what happened throughout that time period was black lives were lost, black businesses were destroyed, and black communities were completely decimated. And because of that, we also saw the land that was originally that of black Americans not only being seized, but new businesses being propped up on the land that we used to call our own. Next slide, please. Then we have the picket fence period. So essentially in the 20th century, federal asset building moved from land ownership to the promotion of home ownership. And so this is when we have agencies like the Federal Housing Administration come into place, and this agency really served as the engine of discrimination against black home buyers during this time period. Well, through practices like redlining, we saw black homeowners who were seeking to purchase a home being denied the opportunity to do so. And what happened as a result is they were completely cut out on the opportunity to accumulate wealth through home ownership. What also happened during this time period is this act called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which essentially was the legislation for the GI Bill. And so when you had returning veterans coming back into America, they supposedly had the opportunity to receive low-interest home loans, tuition, a college or vocational training, and things of that sort. But almost exclusively, those benefits went to white Americans, and black Americans were completely cut out of the process. So again, you have another instance where the federal government, through their policies and their flawed administration or discriminatory ways in which they administered the policies, was helping to create wealth for white Americans, but at the same time preventing black Americans from accumulating wealth. Then we have the freeway period, which is essentially the urban renewal projects of the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, where James Baldwin called it Negro removal, because what was happening is our communities were yet again under attack by the federal government. So when you see a lot of these big highways that cut through many of the major cities throughout the United States of America, they were purposely propped up for the intent purpose of forcing displacement of black families. So many black businesses were forced to shutter, and also what happened is homes were lost, and the equity within the homes for black Americans were lost as well. And so, again, we have periods that even go beyond the ones that I'm naming here, but because of the limited amount of time that I had, I'm not in a position to continue to move this story into present day reality. However, I do want to talk to you all briefly about something called true reparations. Next slide, please. So, there are many schools of thought when it comes to what constitutes a reparations program. And I've studied them. And there are definitely arguments that have been put forth by all schools of thoughts that I see value in. However, when I think about a true reparations program in this country, the federal government is the culpable and capable party. The culpability comes from the fact that it's within the legal framework established by the federal government that all of the atrocities and forms of anti-black violence perpetrated against my community was allowed to occur. So when we think about the state's involvement in a lot of the atrocities that we observe here, when we think about the local municipality government's involvement, when we think about churches, when we think about schools, colleges, universities, families, individuals, again, it's only within the context, the legal context established by the federal government, that these atrocities can occur in a way that goes unaddressed generation after generation after generation. In terms of capability, if we assume that the racial wealth gap in this country is the result of the intergenerational cumulative effects of white racism in this country, then it means that the racial wealth gap serves as the primary indicator of those injustices perpetrated against black Americans. And if we assume that a check needs to be cut as the form of reparations, then technically speaking, our local and state governments can never meet the bill required to close the racial wealth gap, which some of our leading economists estimate is minimally $14 trillion. To put it in context, the combined budgets of our state and municipal governments are less than $5 trillion. So again, when we have a lot of conversations about what our state governments or local governments may doing within the context of reparations, I would argue and humbly suggest that we revisit the language, because those are racial equity initiatives, which are equally important. However, equity initiatives account for contemporary disparities within our society, whereas a reparations program specifically for Black Americans should close and eliminate the racial wealth gap that exists between Black and white Americans, because that is where we see the starkest disparity from a wealth standpoint. And I would also say that, again, this needs to be federally led, federally funded, and it needs to be descendant specific. And when I say descendant specific, I'm talking specifically about Black Americans who are descendants of U.S. slavery here within America. This is a conversation that, quite frankly, can be its own separate panel discussion, but I really commend this commission because it's evident in the name of the commission that they're thinking about this in a way that's consistent with the arguments put forth by some of our leading reparations scholars within this country. Next slide, please. And so, next and final slide, because I think I'm over my time. And so, go back, please. In closing, I just have a call to action for the commission. First, it starts with affirming publicly that a true reparations program must be federally led, federally funded, and designed specifically for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Secondly, we must adopt a formal resolution urging Congress to act federal reparations legislation that is grounded in frameworks of either acknowledgement, redress, or closure, which is advanced by one of our leading reparations scholars, William Sandy Darity, and his partner and wife, Kirsten A. Mullen, and or the framework that has already been adopted by the United Nations. In addition to that, I would ask that we call on our Illinois federal delegation, our U.S. senators, and our representatives to sponsor and advance a comprehensive reparations program and legislation. And last but definitely not least, just to reiterate a point I made previously, we need to continue to develop and fund state-level equity initiatives while maintaining clear public language and communications that distinguishes these equity-based initiatives from a reparations program, because we do not want to water down what it is we're ultimately trying to achieve, which is to close and eliminate the racial wealth gap in this country. And so with that being said, I would like to say thank you.
Peace, Doc, peace. So what's the main takeaway of today?
Unity.
You say unity?
Unity and reparative justice.
Absolutely.
Are you all going to the lobby?
Yes.
Great. Level 5.
Okay.
So break that down in your own words.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for us as a people to come together and unite around a righteous and just cause. Reparations is one of the longest justice-based movements in this country, and unfortunately, we've yet to receive any form of reparative justice for the historic and contemporary harms perpetrated against our people. And so the opportunity to unite around a just cause is something that's worth pursuing. And I'm just grateful and thankful to Almighty God for using me as a vessel to help bring this justice into the world.
Absolutely. So what's the biggest war when it comes to justice? Is it financial or spiritual, you think?
Well, I would say it's a combination of the two. But if we're thinking about reparations in the U.S. context,
Yes, sir.
we need reparative justice that is going to be economic in nature, but that should be the baseline and the foundation for what the reparations movement looks like here in this country. Our wealth was stolen from us, and reparations is a way for us to reclaim it in more ways than one. This whole notion of sovereignty, having our own land, and why it's important for us to not only receive reparations in a monetary sense, but how do we receive those economic resources in such a way where to be in service of us having our own land that we can call home, that we run and control outright. And I think that needs to be another part of the conversation with the reparations movement. It's not just about us receiving a check, but once we have the check, how do we as a people pool our economic resources together to have something that we can call our own, because it's something that we deserve. That's why I brought it up in my opening remarks about Reverend Garrison Frazier. He talked with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General William T. Sherman, not just about us receiving land, but us also receiving freedom to have our own land and use it in a way that we saw fit, because he knew that the prejudice against white Americans towards black Americans was so great that it would take generations to overcome. He said that back in 1865, but when you think about a lot of the atrocities that have been perpetrated against our people, that comes all the way up into 2025. So we're still catching the same hell. And so as a people who should be guided by truth and wisdom, we have to make wiser decisions about if we want to continue to live in this house, or do we want to separate and build something for ourselves. And it's going to be a choice that folks are going to have to make very soon. I think about somebody like John the Revelator in the book of Revelations. He talked a great deal about Babylon the Great has fallen because she has become a habitation of evil and wickedness for all who stay within her. And his instructions were to come up out of her. And so we have to think about, what does it mean for us as a people who want to be righteous, who want to lean into the principles of justice, to come up out of a nation that, quite frankly, hasn't affirmed our dignity, and build something that we can call our own and have it so that righteousness is at the foundation of all of what we do. And if we have righteousness at our foundation, God will protect us.
Wait, say that one more time so they can hear that.
If we have righteousness as our foundation, God will protect us.
In that order. Yes, sir.
Look! This is the eye of the trenches!